Hello and welcome to Mini Fights. I'm Brian, and I like to paint stuff. Today I'm painting Skytear, specifically the Liothan faction from the starter set. Liothan are one of the 4 factions from this game, and their theme is sort of a Viking, shapeshifter, winter tundra sort of look. A lot of fur, a lot of ice, blues, greens, etc. So the first component I decided to tackle was the fur, and I decided to go with kind of a warm tone to offset some of the blues and greens we're going to be putting in later. This is P3 Bloodstone, a nice covering orangey brown, very saturated, intense color, which is usually what I like to start with, especially when we end up using a lot of washes, which we are going to use some washes on these miniatures. Speaking of intense colors, here's some Signar Blue Base, also a P3 color. Most of the paints I use on these miniatures ended up being P3 and a little bit of Vallejo here and there. And we're just going to work this in. Basically, I like to start on these Skytern models by blocking everything in. Often that's because I'm using a lot of washes, and then you can sort of wash multiple colors at the same time. And here we go, some more blocking in. This is Menoth White Base, another P3 color. It's just a kind of a bone white color, basically. And it has a sister color called Menoth White Highlight, which is, as you would guess, used to highlight Menoth White. And we're going to use that later, after we apply some washes. Continuing with our blocking into the miniatures, we're now just putting in some base coats of the flesh. This is P3 Midland Flesh. And this is a good base point to start with for sort of a Caucasian skin tone. Now, Meridius Blue is one of my favorite colors, actually. As you can see, it's just a really vibrant, intense blue-green. And I tend to use it for a lot of things that glow. For these miniatures, I tried to work it in where anything sort of magical would be occurring. So after some deliberation, I was trying to figure out where to put it on this bear man. And I decided to put it in his mouth and in his eyes, which I think worked out pretty well. It kind of implies that he's a monster and a shapeshifter a little bit more. To continue the crystalline, glowing, blue-green magic on the minions, I decided to put it on the little ice spikes growing out of their heads, their arms, and they have kind of a warhammer with like a rune on it, so I put it on there as well. Now we're moving into our big wash. This is going to establish the shade over the majority of the miniature. We're pretty much just sloshing all over everything we've painted so far. The 4 colors we've worked in. This is just Army Painter Strong Tone, excuse me. And the Strong Tone You need a little bit of medium mixed into it, a little bit of water, but otherwise, you know, you gotta nanny it a little. Like you can see here, I'm kind of wiping off some puddling and letting the models dry on their sides and kind of rotating them. Little rotisserie chickens. Once your rotisserie chicken's dry though, it usually places itself where it should be. I find it's probably the best wash product for my style of painting. You're gonna see this a lot if you're a new painter. In a lot of tutorials, a lot of army painting, kind of you know, tabletop-worthy painting. People applying washes to miniatures and then going back with the original color and highlighting with the original color, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm just taking the Menoth white base and applying it back onto that area. But the wash, in addition to shading it, has also tinted the color and pushed it darker in value. So we can go in and use our first highlight layer can just be the original color. After that, we're going to take the aforementioned Menoth white highlight, and we're going to go ahead and do what the tin says, and use it to highlight. The highlights on some of the fur areas here, I'm applying in kind of a streaky fashion, just to apply a little bit of a textured look. The majority of the work with this step is going to be here on Korjov's clothing, because I kept most of it sort of that bone white. It's really nice to finally get into the highlighting steps. This is, you know, those first base coats and washes are really more laborious than art, in my opinion. This is where you get to kind of flex your muscles a little, decide where to put light. So I wanted these feathers to be, you know, the implication is that Korjov's feathery cloak is like magical. Maybe the feathers aren't even actually feathers, they're sort of like arcane constructs floating around him. So I decided to really jump up in value and make them really pop more than the other areas. So the value shifts in this Meridius blue to the mix of Meridius blue and a little bit of white and a little bit of Menoth white is a pretty big jump. Don't be intimidated by painting the little spiky things in the head and on the arms. You can kind of just use the side of the brush to just let the little top edge pick up the highlight. You know, your first highlight is probably the, you know, from 1 to 50% of the area, and then your final highlight can be maybe 10 to 20% of the area. And that's what we're doing here. The final highlight, to make this really pop and make it look like a glowing kind of a light source in some areas, is to just apply straight white as an edge highlight. Now, one thing I will say, as far as after base coating the model with the Meridius blue, but before going to this step where you're rendering it, I would address the fur first, and you're going to see why as we move into the fur here. I do a dry brush, right? And I have all giant brushes, unfortunately. I need to buy some new dry brushes here, but it doesn't really matter when you're dry brushing. You can't really avoid areas you painted really nicely. So as I dry brush here, I did touch a few areas on the minions, and there on Gulbjarn, who's the bear man. Just got a little bit on the areas I painted around his eyes and stuff, so I had to go back and touch that up. It's not a huge deal, but if I was planning this paint scheme out again, I would address this bloodstone brownish areas first, then do the highlights on the Meridius blue, the glowing blue-green stuff. Now after the dry brush, the value jump is a little too high, and I wanted to take away just a touch of that. So we kind of just do a quick, it's a wash, but kind of a glazy wash, like try to take away the majority of the wash itself. Don't let it puddle too much of Army Painter's soft tone, which is a lighter brown that's maybe shades a little more towards red than the dark tone. What did I say earlier? Not dark tone, strong tone. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's lighter than strong tone. It's also a little reddish, which fits what we're trying to do here. We're also reapplying a little more depth to the fur, and you can see as soon as I put this wash on, all the recesses kind of jump out at you, but the dry brush layer that we put on is still there. So it kind of ties the room together. It pushes the values and sort of further apart, which is ideal. You want a big value contrast jump on all your areas. So this just kind of reinforces that. It also tints the color down a little, takes a little of the yellowy feel out of it. This is probably the most challenging part of this scheme, which is working with Signar Blue base and mixing in, opaque whites into it. As you can see, that next layer of highlighting doesn't really sort of naturally blend in due to transparency. It kind of sits on top as a layer, but that's all right. We're just you have to kind of know where to put it, and I would say less is more. And when you start painting sort of opaque highlights like this, there's a few different methodologies to how much you build up. I'm kind of down the middle. I use more than some people and less than others. But that middle layer, I'm putting quite a bit of it down here, I would say, especially like on these pants and stuff. And to get kind of a blend, so to speak, I'm sort of feathering it on with horizontal strokes. And that kind of fits also that it's fabric, and fabric tends to crease that way. So sometimes in larger areas, you have to kind of, with an opaque color like that, you have to kind of come up with ways to sort of get the edges to blend a little, and that's kind of what that intent is, without building a whole bunch of layers and doing a whole bunch of blending. And now we're on to the last layer, and again, a good value jump here. I'm not worried that the light I'm putting on doesn't perfectly blend with the layer beneath. That's not the intent, and that shouldn't be anyone's intent unless you are painting like a really high standard display miniature. This is to see the creases, to see those edges, to see where light would hit, and it should be a pretty good jump. It's not quite as big of a jump as the feathers, but it's a good one. Now with a rounded surface, like the kind of tubular legs of this model, the buttock muscles, things like that, it's kind of hard to find sharp edges to edge highlight. I concentrated around the rips of the fabric where his legs are showing through, and a few other spots, as you can see. So I dig out some P3 Umbral Umber, and I base coat the hammers, just to get them unified. While I've got it out though, this is a pretty good color for lining. And I thin it out a little bit, and I just define some of the areas, the edges. So I'm putting it like, for example, between Khorzhov's arm and the feathers. I also did his eye sockets. Here on Gulbyarn, I am redefining the edges around the flesh in the ripped pants just to make sure that that still stands out. Sometimes you have to go back and repair areas that you've been building layers on. Maybe you mess up a little bit and cover up a shaded area. This is a really fun step here. So this flesh tone actually came out really good. This is the first time I'd ever tried this particular flesh mix by mixing the P3 paint with the Vallejo Sunny flesh tone, which I've been looking for and finally found locally at basically the greatest paint store of all times, Michigan Toy Soldier. They have literally everything you could ever want. So I got this paint there finally after wanting it for a while and just forgetting to buy it. And I'm using it here to block in the majority of the muscle. So I'm probably covering up 60 to 70% of the surface area with this mix. After that, I'm going to go ahead in and I'm going to highlight it with one more step. One of the keys with painting flesh is that the steps that I took on the blue, like the pants and the feathers, those really hard edge highlights where I jumped to like almost pure white or like a whitish color, you really can't do that with flesh. Flesh doesn't do that in real life. It's kind of matte and it's kind of semi-translucent, I guess. It just doesn't reflect light like a hard surface does. And if you make really big jumps, it just doesn't generally look right. So the jump I'm making here is a little more subtle. It does show some of the final edge light, you know, things like knuckles and cheekbones and the tip of the nose. But otherwise, it's not as nearly as big of a jump as those other colors we touched. This is obviously a super easy step here. This is a Vallejo model air color, so it is not super thick right out of the bottle. Definitely don't need to thin it. You can just use it right out of the bottle to apply. It took a couple coats to get it nice and opaque. And after those coats dry, I grab my gigantic dry brush and I dry brush in a little bit of P3 Thrall Flesh, which is kind of a greenish gray color. And there's some sculpted details on these bases, but they're a little hard for me to read, and I'm not actually in love with painting sculpted details with like bright colors and kind of things that pull your eye off the miniature. So I kind of decided to just sort of paint, dry brush, and then add a few little visual interest tufts and things like that, rather than paint those like they were, you know, ice flows or something like that, where they would maybe pull the eye off the model by virtue of just being a little too eye-catching and high contrast. You can see my little bag of snow. I swear that's not cocaine. I mean, I really like these miniatures, but cocaine's expensive, man. After the cocaine goes on, I mean the snow goes on, the tufts get glued on, as you've seen in some of the other videos. A little combination of two basing materials on top of a dry brush base is like pretty much the sweet spot, I think, for most armies or most things like this project where they're kind of painted to a tabletop standard. And we have done it. We have hit the final step, the greatest step of all. I dig out my super glossy black paint, put a little on the palette, don't dilute it, we want it nice and thick, and just paint the base edges. And man, every time it's the best. Watching it on video, I just get that little high like each time over and over again. Now off camera, of course, after this, I do give these guys a couple coats of gloss varnish. They have some sheen from the washes. They have some sheen from the P3 paint. P3 paint has a little bit of a satiny finish, so it can sometimes have kind of a shine. This gloss I'm using on the edges here is very shiny. So they were hit with a matte varnish before the photography. As you can see here, they're nice and dry looking. And there we are. Probably, I would say 3.5 to 4 hours worth of work if you're experienced. If you're working your way through it for the first time, maybe a little bit longer. These are super attainable techniques in my opinion. It's a nice mix of dry brushing and washes with a little bit of highlighting for those intermediate people who are looking to step out of the standards of dry brushing and washing. I've got one more faction from the starter box left to do. It's the green colored Mayan or Aztec themed ones. I'm really excited to paint them. I held them for last because I like them the best. So that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.